Thank you for joining the National Congress of American Indians panel discussion webinar, Voices from Indian Country, Permafrost and Environmental Sustainability. We will begin this webinar in just a moment as we allow for attendees to join. All right, thank you everyone for joining the webinar. We're going to start as more people join. So good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us for our monthly environmental sustainability webinar series, where we hold a panel discussion with tribal and local leaders on the ground. Today's webinar is Voices from Indian Country, Permafrost and Environmental Sustainability. My name is Gwen Evans Lomiespa. I'm a researcher with the NCAI Environmental Sustainability Team and a Hopi tribal member. Before we begin, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping tips before handing this over to our moderator, Larry Wright Jr. Due to the webinar nature of this panel discussion, only the speakers and moderator will have their microphones and cameras accessible. You can share your thoughts with attendees and the panelists in the chat box during the webinar. Today's webinar is scheduled to include a question and answer session. If you have questions at any time throughout the webinar for any of the speakers, please enter your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. An NCAI staff member will be collecting questions throughout the webinar for our moderator at the end. Next, if you're experiencing any technical issues at any time throughout the webinar, please reach out to Sadie Red Eagle or Quinn Buchwald in the chat box. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please disconnect from the webinar now. All right, so the panel is the first of our regular monthly series that will focus on a variety of topics impacting environmental sustainability. Throughout the year, we'll be covering topics that impact different tribal nations and geographies around the United States. Each monthly focus will be accompanied by a publication. This month's publication focuses on explaining what permafrost is, the environmental impacts from permafrost, and some of the impacts tribal nations may be experiencing, and research findings into permafrost. These publications are intended to help those who may not know much about the subject, as well as help those who are experienced in the subject but want more recent research findings. The permafrost publication will be released later this week following today's webinar. You can be the first to know when we officially release the document by following us at Twitter at NCAI 1944, or you can send me an email directly to be sent a copy to your email. The purpose of this webinar panel is to elevate the voices of the communities already experiencing and addressing different environmental impacts. It intends to provide and share information among tribal communities that may be facing similar challenges and connecting folks into finding solutions for adaptations. Thank you for your patience. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for today, Larry Wright Jr. Larry Wright Jr. currently serves as the Director of Leadership Engagement for the National Congress of American Indians. He served as Tribal Chairman of the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska for over 11 years and was a member of the Tribal Council for 4 years prior to that. He represented the Great Plains region as the Area Vice President for the NCAI Board, as well as the representative for the National Indian Health Board. He also served as chairman of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs Board of Directors and chairman of the Nebraska Intertribal Coalition. Mr. Wright has a background in education and management. For 6 years, he served as a social studies teacher for the 7th to 12th graders in Lincoln Public Schools and has owned his own general contracting business. He earned his bachelor's degrees in social science from the University of Nebraska at Kearney and his master's degree in historical studies from Nebraska Wesleyan University. He is also a veteran. Please welcome our moderator, Larry Wright Jr.
Aho, thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Larry Wright Jr. I'll be moderating today's panel with some very distinguished guests to discuss permafrost and environmental sustainability. I'll provide a quick overview of permafrost and the impacts of permafrost thaw before introducing our panelists. For those of you not familiar with permafrost, permafrost is permanently frozen ground. Ground is considered permafrost if it remains frozen solid and below freezing temperatures for 2 years or more in a row. Much of the permafrost up in Alaska and the Arctic, what we will be focusing on today, has remained frozen for thousands of years. There are actually 2 layers for permafrost, the active layer and the permafrost layer. The active layer is below the ground surface, but above the permafrost layer. The active layer thaws every year and the ice within that layer melts. The temperatures in the Arctic and Alaska are warming at a much faster rate than the average global temperature increase. This means that the ground is also warming and the permafrost that was frozen for thousands of years is beginning to rise above freezing temperatures and melt. The active layer is growing and the permafrost layer is shrinking. The permafrost thaw can cause instability in the ground, which impacts infrastructure and forests. It can lead to a change in plant and animal wildlife survival. It contributes to erosion. It releases greenhouse gases and chemicals into the atmosphere and water system, and more. The panelists today will be discussing how the permafrost thaw is impacting their communities, mitigation and adaptation practices, and more. With that incredibly quick overview, I'd like to now introduce our first panelist, Chief Mike Williams of Akiak Native Community. Mike Williams is chief of the Akiak Native Community. He has served his community in numerous positions, including but not limited to as a NCAI area vice president, former president of the Alaska Rural Community Action Program, chairman of the Alaska Intertribal Council, vice chair of the Alaska State Board of Education, and as a board member for the Alaska Humanities Forum and the Native American Rights Fund. As a mental health counselor, he is passionate about 2 things: Iditarod dog sled racing and the cause of sobriety. He has completed in the Iditarod 15 times and the Kushkowin 300 sled dog race 29 times. He combines his interest in mushing for sobriety, educational opportunities, and healthy lifestyles. Chief Williams is also a U.S. Army veteran. He is an active participant in discussions at NCAI conferences about environmental sustainability challenges. Please welcome Chief Mike Williams.
Good morning. It's very good to be here with all of you, and I really appreciate that introduction, and I look forward for a real good discussion on the issue of climate change impacts and the issue of permafrost that is affecting our communities. And I'm witnessing that firsthand in our community here, in our village, and also my travels throughout Alaska and my mushing career of mushing for 80,000 miles in Alaska, and witnessing the impacts of climate change, as well as hunting, fishing, and gathering for foods on yearly basis. And it has been becoming a challenging survival for our wildlife and also our fish on the river. And these impacts are just really, as you mentioned in your introduction, Larry, is affecting us with anxiety and suffering due to the changes in recent years with warming of our land, and also receding of our ice in our rivers and in our coasts. And it has created a lot of impacts of retreating from the rivers because of erosion. And that was due to the lack of permafrost on the rivers that is accelerating erosion, as well as the tundra villages sinking and having to move houses, and the houses are tilting and sinking, and our graveyards are sinking in the tundra as well. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Williams. We appreciate your time joining us today. Now we will introduce Bill Tracy from the village of Point Lay. Bill Tracy's relationship and involvement with the community of Point Lay began in the early 1970s. Bill worked on various construction jobs at Denali National Park, Fairbanks, Point Hope, and Inuktitut Pass. While working on a teacher housing project in Point Hope, he met some folks from Point Lay who invited him to help with the resettling and rebuilding of their community. He has had a very rewarding experience living in Point Lay with his wife of over 45 years, Marie, who is a lifelong resident of Point Lay, raising their 3 sons and now have 5 grandchildren, all while building a community. Several years back, he was voted in as a member of the native village of Point Lay tribe. Bill has worked on an impressive list of entities, boards, and commissions. Bill served as the Point Lay Village Mayor, Fire Chief, North Slope Borough Assembly Vice President, Housing Authority Commissioner, Chairman of the Liskovic College Board of Trustees, and more. He has extensive experience with the challenges from permafrost and infrastructure. Mr. Tracy?
You're not.
Maybe having a connection issue.
Yeah, okay. I'm having microphone problems, but and Teku for inviting me to be one of the panelists. I'm humbled to be among some of these great people, great speakers, and moderator himself. So thank you for having me. And I have to give a shout out to Chief Williams. My wife, Marie Nalcock, was a cheerleader for you during your sports endeavors during your Chamawa schooling. So I'd like to first get you folks to figure out a little bit about Point Lay, who we are, where we are, and why. So Point Lay, Alaska, also known as Cully, it's the Inupiat village of Point Lay. Its name. It's located on the Alaska Chukchi Sea coast. We're protected from the open ocean by the Kasagala Lagoon. It's about a 100-mile long lagoon system. Cully, the Inupiat name for the village, means something being dragged or towed. Residents tell a story of a woman seeking high ground for safe refuge by pulling a mound to its current location, which became known as Cully Mound, and refers to the elevated ground on which the original village stood. Now, the coastal plain, which extends southwest of Point Lay to Cape Buford, is characterized by low, wet tundra, scattered lakes, and meandering streams. The nearest villages are Wainwright, 93 miles northeast, and Point Hope, 133 miles southwest. Both communities are situated along the Chukchi Sea coast. Now, Point Barrow, now known as Utkalvik, the government seat of the North Slope Borough, is located approximately 190 miles northeast. There aren't any roads connecting any of the North Slope 8 communities to each other. Now, due to flooding, ocean storm surge, and coastal erosion, Point Lay has relocated 3 times in the past 50 years. The original village site, located on a barrier island, had eventually lost enough land mass, since its original settlement in the late 1800s, becoming a permanent village in 1930 when the BIA school was built. Shortly after ANSCA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, became law, Point Lay was beginning to resettle. Only one family was living in Point Lay full-time during the 60s. There was a United States Air Force due station, which is kind of a radar station located on the mainland. And of course, they were occupying the good ground, well elevated above the ocean and the lagoon. So the new town site that we had to build was on an island up our local Kukolik River. And by 1972, there was a bounding 36 residents. When I arrived a year later, there was 46 people, 13 of which were children schooling in a dilapidated one-room BIA school building. A year later, we had completed the construction of 10 homes, a 2-room schoolhouse, a store, and a power plant. But unfortunately, the island proved to be too small to support a growing community. The tundra was wet, and the entire island flooded during spring breakup due to its slight elevation above the river. Not enough acreage for an airport, and simply too wet for roads. Due to those environmental conditions and the truly difficult logistics gaining access to the due station airport, we were forced to relocate the village once again. So in 1980, we had received a portion of that Air Force land, which was on high ground and close proximity to the airport. That winter, we moved homes. We put them up on trailers and skidded them to the new site. And by 1982, we had completed the relocation. There was just the one road in that new town site that the Air Force had used to access random dump sites and the staging of thousands of oil drums. We're still cleaning up that mess. There was a second road just over a mile long, ending up in a freshwater lake, which we share with the Air Force as a drinking water source. Now, our government, the North Slope Borough, had played a big role with the village relocation and the site preparation at the new village location. Quarried a gravel source to build roads and gravel building pads, and for slurry for backfilling our piling foundations. In 1984, the North Slope Borough introduced a massive $400 million capital improvements program shared by the 8 North Slope villages, which gave us a new school, a fire station, health clinic, public works facility, and several pieces of heavy equipment, a power plant, and a 1 million-gallon water holding tank. We continue building as our population flourishes to 150 residents. Added onto the school, built many new homes, second water holding tank, and another 2 subdivisions. So every year we build up our community with our cut of the capital improvement funds. All told, we have a direct Barry water distribution system, complete with fire hydrants, a beautiful school facility, new power plant, a 3rd water holding tank to accommodate our population of over 300 today, including 100 students attending school. Now, this, what I consider the end of an ice age phenomenon, brought on climate change, permafrost degradation, subsidence, and erosion, which have all contributed to the failure and destruction of many of the components of our infrastructure over a short period of time. Because our school was built in stages, there are many issues with movement, settling, window and door issues, roof issues. We lost one of our water holding tanks, the first one built. The floor gave out because of the undermining and the subsidence. We lost our entire freshwater lake. It was 30-acre lake or bigger. The shoreline bank eroded away and the lake became part of the river. Our water sewer system that we buried in the permafrost under our roads and driveways has been abandoned for half of the community. And the cost to maintain and repair is staggering. Every year, that's a big part of our capital improvements funding. Many fire hydrants have failed. The fire station foundation has failed, and we have to relocate our fire apparatus. Roads and driveways have sinkholes and or can't support heavy vehicles during the summer. House foundations are failing. These are just 10 by 10 or 12 inch by 12 inch, 25 to 30 foot long timbers buried in the ground, 10, 12, and 15 feet, depending on the size of the building. and they're failing because of the subsidence has weakened their support. Our slab on grade and floating slabs are failing. We're developing deep ponds throughout the community. Sewage holding tanks are failing because they just can't keep them level. Honey buckets, which is a indoor version of an outhouse, our honey buckets are being dumped into boxes alongside the road, and of course they get plowed up when they're under snow or spilled, and that seepage gets into those ponds. We're a mess. Drainage culverts through our road are too high because of the subsidence on both sides of the road. Power poles are leaning. Sewage lagoon at the landfill has been reactivated because our plant isn't capable of our mess. Our STP sewage treatment outfall line is failing. Communication towers and antennas are needing constant alignment. So when we look back, say 100 years, Point Lay became a permanent village site only because its previous location 50 miles north had eroded into the sea. Now, after 3 other locations for our town site, we just haven't found peace at home yet. So it's a work in progress. We're not sure if we're going to maintain this location or have to move. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tracy. That was very interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. And now we'll introduce our final panelist, Dr. Daly Sambo-Duro from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Dr. Daly Sambo-Duro, Inuit Alaska, is the international chair for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, a non-governmental organization that represents approximately 180,000 Inuit from Chukotka, Alaska, Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. She holds a PhD from the University of the British Columbia, Faculty of Law, and a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She is also a senior scholar and special advisor on Arctic Indigenous peoples at UAA, and presently the Arctic region representative to the Facilitative Working Group, the newest constitutive body of the UNFCCC. Welcome, Dr. Daly Sambo-Duro.
Pianak, thank you for this opportunity. And first of all, let me express my gratitude to Larry for the introduction, but also to National Congress of American Indians for hosting this particular event. And I'll just share a few broad remarks and echo actually some of the things that have been said by both Mike and Bill. But before doing so, I think it's important for us to understand that for Indigenous peoples, taking the issue of permafrost alone is really in contrast to how we view the world. All of these issues are interrelated, and the permafrost thaw is just one of the many cascading impacts of climate change that we are suffering from. And I think this is important to recognize at the outset that impacts are political, they're economic, they're social, they're cultural, and even spiritual to a large extent. As Larry indicated early on in the remarks that he provided, the Arctic and permafrost thaw is happening at a much faster rate. Many may not know that this permafrost and technically ground that's been frozen for at least 2 years, but in our case for thousands of years. This is something that we have understood and have relied upon in terms of food and food storage, food preparation, food security, a whole host of things. It's important to note that Alaska has approximately 85% of our area is underlain with permafrost, and there again, it's quite significant. This dynamic of permafrost thaw, it's also important to understand that it's actually probably even more urgent than some of the other impacts that we're seeing, because permafrost thaw is literally the alteration of the subsurface hydrology of the ground. And though it's been thawing as far back as the 1700s, it has accelerated significantly starting in the 1990s. And one of the significant things about it, and the reason why I say it's even potentially more urgent, is that we're talking about the release of methane, the release of additional greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, which then creates its own loop in terms of accelerating the impacts of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has indicated that the thaw of permafrost is irreversible on a human relevant time frame. So we're talking about not really mitigation or adaptation in relation to permafrost thaw, but the fact that there is very little that we can do once this thaw has actually taken place. And so its potential is, it is a matter of urgency. But in addition to that, the current numbers that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is addressing, and the Conference of the Parties or UN member states in the Climate Change Treaty, and the models that are being developed by scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, don't take into account this factor of permafrost thaw and the emissions of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, and methane. And so if you understand those elements, you can see how quickly and easily this has become a subject of concern, and should be a subject of concern on the part of tribes and their membership, not only in Alaska, but First Nations and others throughout the Arctic region, but globally, because of how interrelated the Arctic region is to the whole of the globe. So I guess what I'm saying is that this impact is here and now. We've been seeing it for decades. The fact that there are 227 tribes in the United States, nearly half of all tribes in the whole of the US are in Alaska. The impacts that we're seeing are related to, as both Mike and Bill Tracy have already said, some devastating impacts. The flooding, the erosion, the imminent threats, the relocations that have been cited already are significant. And of course, permafrost thaw is a contributing factor. Many have become familiar with Newtok as a community whose shoreline is eroding. Of course, permafrost thaw is one of the elements. The other impacts, as Bill has commented already, is infrastructure, water quality. And when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about housing, airports, everything. There's the list goes on and on. So I think that the main message I want to provide here is that not only are we suffering from the cascading effects of climate change, but permafrost thaw should be seen as a matter of urgency by our communities. So I'll leave it there for now. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of these messages.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Appreciate those opening remarks. And I want to thank again all of our panelists for your introductory remarks and for participating today in this panel discussion. I will now ask questions of each of our panelists and allow for time for discussion between them on the questions. And our first question for our panelists. We know that there are several ways that the permafrost thaw can impact different communities. What is the most concerning or most immediate concern to your community from the permafrost warming? And Chief Williams, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think in our community, we have witnessed and start mitigating retreat from the river that is eroding at a rapid pace. And we have relocated last summer 6 homes, get them out of the river, and dealing with the issues of you know, the water, sewer, the electricity, the infrastructure that we have built. And we have removed a lot of structures from alongside the river due to rapid erosion that is occurring. And at one point, we lost approximately 150 yards in 6 hours along the river. And it was very dangerous situation for our children and for our belongings, for our dogs along the river that reside there. And we had to remove some of those houses, drag them on our own to another location away from the river. And it was it caused a lot of anxiety, and people didn't sleep very well for a few days because we were wanting to do that. And but we did temporary fixes, putting some you know, plastic covering along the river temporarily to help stop the erosion or slow it down. And our community, we invested a lot of our resources doing that, and we don't have very much resources to do that. So it has been very challenging to do that, and that's the immediate threat we have in our community. And we are also planning to move more structures, you know, that are 200 yards away from the river, and we're planning to do a managed retreat on all of those structures that are being threatened by the river. And so we're constantly monitoring this every year, and how much erosion we're experiencing. And so I think that is the biggest threat we have in our community, with lack of permafrost that we've lost. You know, we did a lot of burial under 6 feet, about 6 feet for those people that passed on. And we have noticed that in the last 20 years, we have lost a lot of permafrost, that top layer, and that it's getting on the bottom layer as well. So we're losing, when we dig down for our refrigeration of our foods, you know, there's the permafrost is going away fast in the last 20, especially the last 10 years that we've witnessed. And I think that is the most pressing concern that we have alongside the rivers, up and down the river on the Kuskokwim, and also our relatives over at Newtok, Muhtawik. They're moving to Muhtawik where they get water, and all of my relatives are moving, and they have no other choice. And we've been thinking about those people in Kivalina as well as Shishmaref, and all of those communities along the coast, up and down the Bering Sea. We've been very concerned and supportive of their concerns for erosion and needing to move. And I just really appreciate that story from Point Lay and about their moving, and we're we'll be running out of places to move, but because of the land issues that we deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Williams. The impact to hear on burials alone is very sad to hear. I know, Mr. Tracy, you alluded to this in your opening remarks. If you're still there with us, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, and thank you. Just have to comment that I was at the ICC conference in Nunavik, and I got to see how they have basically put their water sewer systems above ground, whereas here on the North Slope, we chose to put it underground. And I think we're in error up here. Because of my positions on the North Slope Borough Planning Commission and now the North Slope Borough Assembly, I've also worked with the mayor on helping him decide which projects to fund with our capital improvements money. I'm witnessing concerns in all 8 North Slope communities. I have that vantage point where I get to see all their project requests and why they're requesting it, the failure of foundations and water sewer systems. Also, because of the Planning Commission, I've worked with the oil patch, the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, and there's constant maintenance there on roads and infrastructure. So it's so widespread on the 95,000 square miles of the North Slope Borough overseas that it's just a tremendous burden on any of our financial capabilities. But I've been to Point Hope, the village of Point Hope, with their coastal erosion. They tried Band-Aid fixes. They lost their ice cellars. They're traditional ice cellars that are hundreds and maybe thousands of years old. They're all flooded and dilapidated. Barrow or Utkalvik, they have to build a massive seawall just to protect themselves, not unlike what they did in Kotzebue, where they built this beautiful seawall, and now their front street is very active. Wainwright also lives on a bluff. They had to protect that bluff, and these Band-Aid fixes is what I like to call them. Need constant maintenance, but that Barrow seawall is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Back to Point Lay, there are many impacts that are critical to our everyday living. Just the fact that we've moved the entire community 3 times in the past 50 years, and each time our community was just a little bigger. There was a little more infrastructure, so moves get a little harder. And if we have to do it again, we're going to have to abandon a lot of our infrastructure, and the cost, both leaving it and having to build something new is going to be ridiculous. Mainly our food security is jeopardized. We also lost our ice cellars. These were hundreds of years old back during the pneumatic times. Point Lay was a favorite site for hunting beluga whales. They'd go to Icy Cape to hunt the bowhead whales, and all this meat and food was preserved in the ice cellars. We even put chunks of freshwater ice in the cellars so that when we're in the traditional Point Lay, we have a water source. The subsidence weakening our piling foundations, our homes are moving, windows are cracking, walls are cracking. If your house is on pilings and your kanichuk, your porch is on stilts, they move differently and porches are falling off. And the destruction and loss of our 1 million gallon water tank, we can only get water once a year, and that's during the summer. Otherwise, the water source is frozen. So having to deal with one less storage tank is putting ourselves in jeopardy. Losing the lake was a big deal. So now we're looking for another water source. The state has allowed us to pump water seasonally from the river, has saline, so we've got to do a reverse osmosis deal. And then we distribute it through that direct bury water sewer system. And because we live on a bluff and it slopes down, some engineer thought that a gravity flow system was the way to go, but because of the undermining of our buried pipes, it's like a roller coaster under there, and we all know what doesn't flow uphill. So that's being abandoned and repaired, and it's just an endless cycle. Fire hydrants, it was so nice back when I was fire chief to get fire hydrants, because now instead of the 2,000 gallons that our 2 fire trucks could carry, we had almost an endless supply of water to put out fires, which was unique because before that we'd be shoveling snow into a burning house. We tried to make a recovery. It was just a pretty sad event when we had a house fire. Roads and driveways, because our gravel is not prevalent. We had a nice gravel pile once we dredged the river for gravel, but that dredging projects seem to be all but over because of the cost, looking for dredge operators from the Midwest. Just don't have any in Alaska. We're now having to look at other gravel sources buried underground, or gravel islands up the river, which is a very silty mess, and it could dirty the rivers for the entire summer. Tundra ponds become a critical life health safety issue because, of course, kids love water, and these ponds are getting deeper and deeper. So we're working with the mayor to use the gravel that we pull out of the road, making repairs to the water sewer, using that gravel to fill in ponds. But of course, it's dark, so it absorbs sunlight, and it just gets deeper and deeper. Chief Williams mentioned graves. Our original grave sites on the Cully Mound, if you will, have all but exposed themselves, and we had to relocate and start a new graveyard. And I'm sorry to say that it's really filling up. It's just that's the culture, is to be able to celebrate life and death up here. And when you can't visit the graveyards or you see the mess that they're in, it just takes away from that ceremony. Everything that we sit on the tundra needs constant maintenance, whether it's a fuel tank, a sewage holding tank, it's all moving. And if your sewage tank gets out of plumb, then you can't use it, you can't fill it. So they're constantly trying to drain these things. Our culverts that drain our roads from the high ground down to the low, because of subsidence, that's not working anymore. So we get ponds right in front of these culverts. We have a snow fence. goes for hundreds of yards. And this, because it's so windy up here, and it's windy from both directions, north and south, that snow buildup on both sides of the fence takes almost all year to thaw. And now that is causing new lakes, if you will. It's flooding the tundra. It's just not good. All our trails that we use in the summer with our ATVs have become too muddy. So we have to keep paralleling that trail the next year and again the next. So pretty soon those are really wide trails and it's just a big muddy mess. All in all, things are difficult, but we live in paradise. We're making it work. We camp more than we have in the past. Berry patches have flourished. We're seeing a lot of wildlife. So here we are. And thank you for listening to that.
Appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to our second question, and this will be for Dr. Barrow. Let's focus in first on the impacts to infrastructure. As the more that active layer of permafrost grows and the amount of ground that freezes and thaws every year increases, the active layer and melting permafrost can drastically reshape the landscape and the foundational ground for infrastructure, roadways, buildings, pipes, train tracks. Dr. Rowe, could you talk a little bit about the infrastructure impacts you're seeing in your community, some of the challenges with those infrastructure impacts, and ideas for adapting or overcoming them? I know Mr. Tracy alluded to his there, as did Chief Williams, but Dr. Barrow?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just address the question in broad terms and not specifically in relation to my community. I presently live and work in Anchorage, but I did want to just add to the commentary just now shared, and first of all say that consistently and historically, many of our communities have faced an infrastructure deficit. So what we're talking about in many circumstances is substandard infrastructure to begin with, and more power to those tribes and communities that have been able to manage the upgrade to systems much in the way that Bill has spoken of them in terms of potable water, sewer systems, sanitation, et cetera. But in terms of permafrost thaw, we have to also think about water availability, right? So if we already have difficulties, at least in 44 of our villages where there's no potable water, if you have no availability in terms of fresh water and the permafrost thaw with the ground absorbing more water, this is a huge issue in terms of, again, infrastructure, but also the quality of the water in the face of permafrost thaw, the concentration of pollutants, for example, in terms of the quality of water. If you have a system that does chlorine disinfection, and I won't comment further on what Bill said about what we know runs downhill. But if you, in terms of the water quality itself, the turbidity, which then also has impacts on the animals that we rely upon, right? This food security issue becomes huge. And again, as I said before, everything being interrelated, the matter of the abundance of food and the health of the environment impacting the health of the animals that we rely upon, impacting our health, that important connection. But in terms of responses by tribes, I think that there are a host of different recommendations that need to be raised and shared with policy and decision makers, and especially those who hold the purse strings as far as adaptation and mitigation. We're seeing, and it's been spoken of here in the short panel presentations, of the actions that tribes are taking by themselves out there and on the ground to make decisions in response to relocation efforts. What are the priorities at the community level? This expression and the exercise of self-determination at the micro level, at the community level by the tribes is so significant. And I think we can learn a lot from tribes across the United States that are taking the bull by the horns in terms of how climate change is impacting them and coming up with solutions that are homegrown within their communities and through their tribal members. And I think that I do want to point to the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report, which quantified the financial needs of tribes in Alaska, but tribes across the United States in terms of how we respond to this extraordinary infrastructure deficit against the backdrop of all of the interrelated adverse impacts of climate change, including permafrost thaw. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to ask this for Chief Williams. You talked about the burials and what you're seeing there, and just thinking about the kind of cultural impact that has for traditional practices and our ways of life. You mentioned the food storage as well. What are those impacts to the traditional practices of your people that you've experienced, and how is that changing how you practice traditional cultural practices? Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I think we relocated a burial ground and on our own, and we didn't wait for any funding because all of those burial people that were buried there, we had to quickly move because of the quick erosion on the river, and it took 2 years to move the whole burial ground. And it was our young people and our elders that we did mental health outreach counseling, and because of the impacts that it had on our young people, our young men, because they were moving the carcasses, the bodies and etc., bones, skeleton, they had to move those and to create another burial ground. So it was very hard on them, and and for a while the impacts of alcohol abuse and suicides rose at that point when we were able to move them, and then having to deal with the after shocks of those things that we did. And I think there needs to be assessments done for adaptation and mitigation in each community, and it has, I think, similar impacts on each community, but each of the 574 tribes in the nation need to do this assessment on the climate change impacts. And my friends in Quinault Indian Nation in the state of Washington are dealing with what we are dealing with here as well in terms of relocating. But I think that is some of the things that we're dealing with here, and we have to reinforce the community about the ways of life, the impacts, and to assure them that we are doing okay in terms of food. Those cellars that we depended on, it's going away as well. So we depend on more electricity with freezers now, and because of the lack of permafrost that we're dealing with. And in terms of water security, we're having to take a look at capturing, harvesting, and which we have been doing that for a long time. But we're looking at the water security into the future of capturing rainwater and treating that. And we're doing that project right now, and hopefully that we will have security, and because of the impacts of the natural pollutants that are with what Daly alluded to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and coming out of the ground, and mercury and et cetera. But we're taking a look at that. So I think assessments need to be done. Community. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And I want to thank our panelists again, done such a good job talking about all the different impacts that you're facing. The last question I have for our panelists is, we've discussed how the permafrost can impact and destroy infrastructure like buildings, roadways, airports, pipes, et cetera. The maintenance and repair or relocation for infrastructure is incredibly costly. In addition to maintenance and those repair costs, tourism is a big source of revenue for Alaska, and infrastructure is needed to support that tourism sector. What kind of economic impacts are you currently experiencing or see on the horizon? And what kind of support do you need for protecting and strengthening your economic stability? Are there any projects underway or projects that you would like to see? And I'll just open this up for the panel, whoever would like to take that.
I'll give a stab at that. This is Bill. Point Lay is for the North Slope Borough area. We consider it ground zero for this climate change and the effects of permafrost subsidence, erosion. Then you throw something like COVID into the mix, and a lot of the politics from DC. You throw all that into the mix, and it's an uphill battle for almost anything and everything we do. But what I found about Point Lay is our cup is half full here. We're going to make things work the best to our ability. I mentioned that these warmer temperatures, these warmer ambient temperatures have made our berry patches flourish. We're seeing more salmon now than we've ever seen in the past. we harvest a beluga whale, the bowhead whale when the stars are right. And we celebrate each and every event. We share. So what happens in Koktovik, what happens in Unactivik Pass or Barrow affects all of us here on the North Slope because we're sharing and caring with each of our brothers and sisters. So if Unactivik Pass, who really rely on the caribou, have a tough hunt, while then the North Slope Borough will fly hunters into an area that have a lot of caribou and help them get that meat back home. So we're all in this together. And I should include the entire state because we're all pretty much facing some warmer temperatures that kind of change migration patterns, seasons, when rivers freeze, when the lagoon freezes, when and if the ocean freezes anymore. So I mentioned beluga harvest. We've allowed the North Slope Borough scientists to study our belugas, and they've learned more in the past 30 years about belugas than ever before in the past. There was a mention about a question about heavy metals, and there's somewhat of an impact to the beluga whale over the bowhead because of their food chains. The belugas eat fish. The fish are in rivers that may have a heavier concentration of mercury, cadmium. Beluga or the bowhead, they feast on zooplanktons and that, which are less. But we've never been big on tourism, and really now that the ice is receding in the ocean, we have thousands of walruses like to haul out on our beach now. And that became an event that media wanted to be here. Tourism from Kotzebue and other locations wanted to fly up here. And I tell you, when the walruses are on shore, they're very nervous because they're used to being way out in the ocean near their food source in the shallow depths of the Arctic Ocean. But now that they're hauling out, we basically, with my fire department background, we treated that as an incident. We worked with the North Slope Borough Wildlife. We worked with the FAA. We have a restricted airspace over the haul outs, whether they're closer to Wainwright or right here at Point Lay. There's tens of thousands of walruses that are here for almost 3 months. So we've had to change some of our hunting tactics. We don't hunt the pack or the herd because it causes stampedes. And when walruses stampede, they inadvertently kill their young. We've had years when, due to bear scares and other scares, even dogs barking from the village, the walruses are so close that keeps them nervous, and they stampede. So that is going on. We're working with UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the North Slope Borough, and we have an ongoing study with this permafrost, where our children, our school children, had some curriculum called World Bridge, and with drones and all, they're studying and keeping track of erosion. So impacts really are the money it takes to maintain our infrastructure, because we don't have roads interconnecting villages. Air travel has increased. Getting groceries and mail has decreased. The cost is just skyrocketing. So if we have people that want to float our rivers, and because of everything that's going on, that's been limited too. So I think the biggest impact right now from the outside world is we don't get to see a lot of you coming here lately, and that's too bad. It's a beautiful place of the world to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we need to work on getting to our audience questions. Just want to ask our other two panelists if you want to tackle this question quickly.
Yeah, I want to just to share that your question about tourism, that is one of the spin-off effects of climate change and the increased vessel traffic in particular. This phenomenon of the walrus hauling out on land versus on the sea ice and berthing in the coastal seas rather than on sea ice. And this is really the result of other impacts of climate change. Before we get into anything else, I think it's important for us to also mention the significance of Indigenous knowledge and what is available right now in terms of immediate firsthand observations and monitoring about the impacts that, we have all this science taking place, but Indigenous knowledge and what tribes and tribal members have to contribute to the solutions is really significant. The other thing I want to say is that in terms of, especially the questions coming from the audience, we have to be mindful of the fiduciary obligations of government to provide the financial resources for tribes to tackle some of these particular issues. That I think that we've been falling down on that far too much. And finally, that there's great opportunity for cross-fertilization of Indigenous knowledge by tribes, sharing their responses and reactions to adaptation and mitigation and solutions that are coming from the ground up in terms of tribes addressing these heavy problems. And I think even the same just in Alaska in terms of one region and how they're addressing permafrost thaw, for example, in contrast to another region. So I think there are so many moving parts in relation to the impacts of permafrost thaw and climate change that we have to keep in mind some of these other important threads.
Thank you very much, and totally agree that the traditional environmental knowledge is key for us moving forward. Chief Williams?
Yes, we have seen the decline of salmon. No salmon on the Yukon River now, and the salmon are not returning in abundance on the Kuskokwim River, so we're losing a lot of that, and especially on the Yukon this past summer, there was no fishing whatsoever, even to have food on the table. They were not allowed to fish on the Yukon River. But those are some of the impacts that we are dealing with in terms of the tourism. We have not had that tourism issue here in Western Alaska so far. There's limited amount of tourism going on in the hub community of Bethel, and so we're not depending on tourism, and I think due to lack of fish returns and the need to keep our lands pristine, that has been the priority of ours, and I think still have we like to do
I don't know if we lost.
activity, but increasing our broadband, our cyber capabilities in ACAC, and invest more on internet connectivity right now as we speak for economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Williams, and thank you, panelists, for taking this time. we want to open it up to a couple of our questions from the audience. And then when we finish, we'd like to give our panelists a couple minutes for closing remarks. So our first question that we have, the question is, this is a big question, but do you have any recommendations for actions, conversations, etc., that other tribes can engage in to support our relatives in the North, especially those of us working in tribal communities and in tribal education? Does any one of our panelists want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I think we need to help telling the Congress and the administration how important it is to fund relocation projects in Alaska, and we're dealing with water, sewer, and infrastructure that we consistently deal with. And in Western Alaska, we still live in third world conditions. And as Daley alluded to earlier, we don't have that infrastructure, but we need to build it, and hopefully that we will have green communities where we have well insulated housing and improved infrastructure where we can sustain ourselves into the future and keeping our lands and waters pristine. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Duro.
Yeah, I think what I was saying earlier is really about increasing our capacity as Indigenous peoples, as tribes and tribal members. Now, I think that there is a lot of room for collaboration and cooperation around tribally led planning and solutions and partnerships and cooperative efforts. But what Mike has just now said is really significant in terms of all tribes linking arms to ensure that funding is made available, and that it's done so in a fashion that allows for coordination and coherence in terms of what all tribes are doing to protect themselves, whether it's protection in place or whether it's relocation, that we all stand together to find a coherent and coordinated way to bring that funding, which is really the fiduciary obligation of the federal government to tribes, so that we can more easily access the resources that are needed to develop our own adaptation and mitigation plans, to utilize our knowledge out there and on the ground to stave off or to curb some of the really adverse impacts of climate change. The issue of permafrost thaw, I think that this is where we need to amplify our voices together in terms of the impacts of permafrost thaw, and understanding it as a major contributing factor that will only increase if nothing is done to take action to curb it. So thank you for the question, and also for the audience forwarding questions.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I just want to say our second audience question really tied into that advocacy and direct funding, direct action, and you both really alluded to that. And so with that, I know our time is getting short, but we want to make sure we give our panelists some closing moment here to say any final words that you might have. And so with that, I would start with you, Mr. Tracy. Do you have any closing comments?
I do, and thank you for that. And I really appreciate this platform, because people that were unaware or not sure about what's going on in the state of Alaska, and especially what's happening in northern Alaska, it's meaningful to us that we find solutions. And we're working with the University of Alaska. We're working with the state. We're working with cold climate housing industry out of Fairbanks. we're studying the heck out of everything. The North Slope Borough Wildlife Department has been
I
studying
haven't had lunch.
the sea mammals and animals. Um, we when we have rabid foxes or a unknown death of an animal, the wildlife department is here to study it right away. And it's just a collaborative unity of agencies coming up with study programs, including all our local folks. Traditional knowledge is the basis, our starting point, and how things have changed and how we can adapt. So if there's something I can share, is allow these studies to happen. There aren't going to be a lot of solutions, especially when your permafrost could be as much as 1,700 feet deep. And the active layer went from, when I first moved here, from 8 inches to, I don't know, 8 feet now. And some of it doesn't even freeze back throughout the winter. Right now, it's close to 60 below zero outside with the wind chill. And it's amazing that when we auger down to do some repair, we found thaw ground. When we auger down below the lagoon looking for a water source, we find fresh water year round. So things are changing. We're changing with them, in a big eye on the animals of our area. They're also changing their habitat, and we have to make room for them. We're actually in their backyard. So thank you. Thank you for this time.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Dr. Barrow, final comments?
Oh, great, thank you. Just 3 points. I think that everything that that NCAI is doing, that tribes are doing, either individually or collectively on a regional basis, and centered on understanding our perspectives, is significant and important work, and that we just need to continue doing that. Secondly, I do encourage everyone to get their hands on the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report and look at all of the detailed recommendations, including the specific recommendation for creating an all of government coordination structure to support tribes in relation to climate change and other environmental threats. And finally, it may be necessary as a next step in response to some of the important information in the STAC report, or the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report, is to do something specific on the impacts of permafrost, so that we can raise awareness amongst those tribes and First Nations and other Arctic indigenous communities about the impacts of permafrost thaw. As the Inuit Circumpolar Council will continue our work within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and all of these other international fora that presently are not coordinated and do not have a coherent approach to all of the issues facing the Arctic region. So we're going to continue our efforts to try to bring about that coordination and coherence, so that not only we ourselves can contribute to the solutions and contribute in terms of our adaptation and mitigation measures, but that we can share what we are doing with Indigenous peoples in other regions, the North and across the globe. And finally, just Pianak to NCAI for this initiative and our inclusion. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And finally, Chief Williams.
Thank you for this opportunity. I just really appreciate the discussion that is very, very important. And I hope to gather the 229 federally recognized tribes up here, Larry, and with NCAI on the regional type meeting to discuss these issues of climate change impacts, the issue of land that we are dealing with every day, and the environment that we deal with the issue of oil and gas mining and other impacts that are dealing automobile, emissions and power companies. So I think with these forums, I hope that we blow over this variants of COVID. And once we do that, hopefully that we will have another opportunity this summer in the mid-year of NCAI in Anchorage. And hopefully that we can coordinate something, Larry, to have more discussion on these issues that affect us with you. And so they can be collectively be addressed by National Congress of American Indians and in coordination with or help of Inuit Circumpolar Council. And I really appreciate Daly and all the work you've done internationally. And thank you, Tracy, for your sharing. And I learned a lot more from Point Lay, and my best to Isuk up there in Point Lay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Williams. And again, thank you, panelists. It's an amazing time. And as an ex-geography teacher teaching this subject, I learned something here today myself. So I always take that as an honor. It was an honor to be moderator for this panel. And to go into a little bit to what was shared here today, talking about these issues, climate change, the effect of permafrost in the Alaska region, but also as we know how it affects all of our indigenous communities. Dealing with climate change and environmental sustainability has become mission critical for all the tribes, but especially with NCAI, knowing that it is an issue that our people are facing. And I just want to give a shout out real quick to our environmental team. The work that they're doing is just phenomenal on behalf of all of our tribal nations. And just to follow up, to know that this series will be carried out monthly with different topics, but we all know that they're all related to each other, as we are. And we want to make sure that we do have that follow-up, that continued advocacy. To Chief Williams, your point, knowing that mid-year for NCAI is in Alaska, and it has been requested that this be a track that we address. And I know our team is currently working on that. And as we get ready to plan for mid-year in Alaska, we're excited to be able to be there and have this continued discussion, as we will each month and until then. But I'd just take a step back, and one of the questions that was asked, what can be done for that advocacy? And it was shared by two of our panelists specifically, that it's really going to take tribes coming together, linking, as Dr. said, linking arms, standing together. And that's really what we want to make sure that we do better than we've ever done before at NCAI, and show that our strength is in our unified numbers, that the greater our unified voice is and the greater our numbers are as members of NCAI, it'll be hard for any administration or any Congress to ignore or dismiss the tribal nations in this country. And so we want to make sure that we are standing arm in arm with our tribal nations, advocating for their needs, specifically on this issue with climate change, the permafrost issue, and making sure that we are doing everything that we can to advocate from that fiduciary responsibility to policy decisions, and making sure that these issues are addressed. And so this is my little shout out to, and we have work to do in Alaska, and And I've had the honor to work with Chief Williams on the board previously. And we want to do everything that we can to enhance all of our tribal member experiences. And we want to make sure that, and I will be reaching out to our Alaska tribes to see what NCAI can continue to do and further help our tribes advocate for themselves and for each other. And so I stand here, my information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone. Happy to have that discussion. Happy to help in any way that I can, as I know our team will. And so if there's anything that we can do, NCAI stands here ready to help and advocate on behalf of our people. And so with that, I want to thank everybody, thank the team for putting this together. For all of our attendees, sorry if we missed any questions. And again, another special thanks to our panelists for their time and expertise in sharing with us to help us continue to make our tribe stronger and protect our citizens. So with that, I say, Gatega, Wibla, Sheno, thank you all very much. You have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, Gwen.
Thank you, Daly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.